Right now, in homes all across Australia, there are coins sitting completely ignored. 5-cent pieces that most people would toss aside without a second thought. But what if I told you that one of those tiny coins could secretly be worth thousands, even up to $40,000 in the right condition? Today on the Coin Studio, we're uncovering the most mysterious and valuable Australian 5-cent coins ever released. From the earliest decimal strikes to the rare era varieties collectors are still fighting over in auctions today. Because the truth is, some of the biggest hidden treasures in Australia aren't locked away in museums, they're still quietly passing through everyday hands. Let's get started with number 1 coin. The 1966 Australian 5-cent coin is just loose change from a bygone era. But for a select few collectors and sharp-eyed treasure hunters, it represents the beginning of Australia's decimal currency system and, hidden within that massive transition, one of the most intriguing and potentially valuable modern coins ever struck. The year 1966 wasn't just another date stamped onto metal. It marked the historic shift from pounds, shillings, and pence to dollars and cents. A national reset that saw millions of new coins flood into circulation almost overnight, all minted under immense pressure to meet demand. When you first hold this coin, it may not immediately scream rarity. The obverse features the familiar portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, youthful and composed, designed by Arnold Mackin. Her profile faces right, encircled by the inscription Elizabeth II, Australia, 1966. The lettering crisp yet modest, reflecting the design language of the era. The relief is relatively shallow compared to older pre-decimal coins, a practical decision for mass production, yet the elegance remains unmistakable. Flip it over, and the reverse reveals a striking image of an echidna, that uniquely Australian creature captured mid-curl, its spines etched with remarkable detail by designer Stuart Devlin. Surrounding it is the denomination 5 cents, clean and bold, with no mint mark visible, as all coins were produced at the Royal Australian Mint, which had only just begun operations. At first glance, nothing about this coin suggests it could be worth a small fortune, and that's precisely where the mystery deepens. In 1966, the urgency to produce decimal coins led to extraordinarily high mintages, with over 45 million 5-cent pieces struck. Yet within that sea of uniformity, subtle anomalies began to surface years later, whispered about in collector circles before gaining serious attention. Some coins displayed unusual die characteristics, slightly misaligned strikes, faint doubling in the lettering, or irregularities in the echidna's spines. Others showed signs of planchet issues, where the metal blank itself had imperfections before striking, creating textures and marks that shouldn't exist on a standard issue. But the real intrigue lies in the rare transitional errors and experimental strikes that may have slipped through during that chaotic year. There are accounts, often debated but never fully dismissed, of early trial strikes using slightly different die alignments or pressure settings as the mint calibrated its new machinery. A handful of collectors claim to have encountered coins with sharper than normal relief or unusual rim formations, suggesting they were among the very first batches produced before final adjustments were standardized. These aren't the kinds of variations you notice casually. They require a trained eye, patience, and sometimes a bit of luck. One story that still circulates among Australian numismatists involves a retired bank teller in regional New South Wales who, decades after decimalisation, began sorting through old coin rolls kept in storage. Among thousands of ordinary 5-cent coins, one stood out, not because it looked dramatically different, but because something felt off. The strike was unusually crisp, the echidna's spines almost razor-sharp compared to typical examples, and the lettering showed a faint doubling under magnification. When examined by experts, it sparked intense debate, eventually being classified as a highly unusual early strike variant, possibly linked to initial mint calibration. That single coin transformed from forgotten change into a sought-after piece of Australian coin history. Collectors today continue to search through jars, old piggy banks, and inherited collections, chasing the possibility that one of these rare variants is still hiding in plain sight. The excitement isn't just about money. It's about uncovering a piece of the moment Australia reinvented its currency. Every 1966 5-cent coin carries that history, but only a tiny fraction hold the subtle secrets that elevate them into the realm of serious numismatic treasures. The absence of a mint mark, once seen as ordinary, now adds to the challenge, forcing collectors to rely entirely on microscopic details and deep knowledge rather than obvious identifiers. What makes this coin particularly fascinating is how accessible it still feels. Unlike ancient rarities locked away in museums, the 1966 5-cent coin was meant for everyday use, passed from hand to hand across the country. That accessibility fuels the ongoing hunt, keeping collectors engaged and hopeful. It's the idea that something so small, so common on the surface, could quietly hold extraordinary value that keeps people searching late into the night, examining coins under bright lamps, comparing edges, studying die markers, and sharing discoveries across forums and collector groups. And then comes the moment every collector dreams of, the realization that the coin in their hand isn't just another piece of change, but one of those elusive variants, preserved in remarkable condition or bearing the telltale signs of a rare era. In top condition, with confirmed unique characteristics or early strike features, the 1966 Australian 5-cent coin has been known to reach staggering values, climbing anywhere from $10,000 to as high as $40,000 in the right market, under the right circumstances, with the right story behind it. And if you think that's where the hunt peaks, you're only just getting started, because the next coin waiting to be uncovered is even rarer, even more mysterious, and carries a value that could completely redefine what you think loose change is worth. Next up, there's a certain kind of silence that surrounds coins most people ignore, the kind that builds over decades as they pass unnoticed through countless hands, settling into drawers, jars, and forgotten corners of Australian homes. The 1977 Australian 5-cent coin is one of those pieces, unassuming, small, and often dismissed as spare change, but beneath that ordinary surface lies a story that unfolds like a slow-burning mystery, one that only reveals itself to those patient enough to look closer. Unlike the dramatic introduction of decimal currency in 1966, 1977 came quietly, with no national fanfare, no sweeping reform, just another year of production at the Royal Australian Mint. And yet, it's precisely that quietness that allowed something extraordinary to slip through. Pick up a 1977 5-cent coin, and the first thing you notice is its familiar weight and silvery tone. Composed of cupra-nickel, resilient and designed to endure decades of circulation. The obverse once again bears the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, still the Arnold Mackin design introduced in 1966, but by this time often showing subtle wear in circulated examples. Her profile remains dignified, facing right, surrounded by the inscription Elizabeth II, Australia, 1977. Each letter evenly spaced, though on some specimens collectors have reported slight variations in spacing and depth, the kind of detail that only becomes apparent under magnification. The rim, typically consistent, occasionally reveals minor irregularities, clues that something during the minting process may not have been perfectly aligned. Turn the coin over, and the echidna greets you again, its spiny form etched with intricate detail by Stuart Devlin. But here is where the story begins to shift. On standard coins, the echidna's spines are sharp yet uniform, the ground beneath it textured with fine dots, and the inscription 5 cents arches cleanly above. However, certain 1977 examples exhibit subtle but undeniable anomalies. Some show unusually thick or softened spines, as if the die had begun to fatigue earlier than expected. Others display faint doubling along the lettering, particularly noticeable in the words where edges appear slightly shadowed. These are not dramatic mint errors that leap out at you, they are whispers in metal, barely perceptible unless you know exactly what to look for. By the late 1970s, the Royal Australian Mint had become highly efficient, producing coins in massive quantities with remarkable consistency. But even in such controlled environments, perfection is never absolute. Die wear, pressure inconsistencies, and the sheer volume of production can create micro-variations that, over time, become the focus of intense collector interest. In 1977, something unusual seems to have occurred during certain production runs, possibly related to die maintenance schedules or adjustments in striking pressure that resulted in a small number of coins with distinct characteristics. These weren't officially documented at the time, which only deepens the intrigue. The real turning point in the coin story came decades later when dedicated Australian collectors began comparing notes. In small numismatic circles and at local coin fairs, whispers started circulating about odd 1977 fives, coins that didn't quite match the standard profile. One collector in Victoria reportedly discovered a roll of uncirculated coins tucked away in a family estate, each one displaying an unusually bold strike with pronounced detail on the echidna and sharper than normal lettering. Another enthusiast in Queensland found a circulated example with clear doubling on the obverse inscription, sparking debates about whether it was a genuine double die or simply mechanical doubling from the minting process. As more of these coins surfaced, patterns began to emerge. Certain die pairs appeared to have been used briefly before being replaced, leaving behind a limited number of coins with identifiable traits. Some pieces showed what collectors describe as transitional die states, where early strikes are crisp and detailed, while later ones from the same die exhibit progressive wear, creating a spectrum of appearances within the same year. This variability transformed the 1977 5-cent coin from a common issue into a field of study, where each specimen could potentially tell a slightly different story. What makes this coin particularly compelling is the lack of obvious markers. There's no mint mark to guide you, no official record pointing to a rare variety, just subtle differences that require experience and a keen eye to detect. It turns the act of collecting into something closer to detective work, where every coin must be examined, compared, and questioned. It's this uncertainty that fuels the hunt, drawing in collectors who thrive on the challenge of uncovering hidden details others overlook. There's also a certain romance in the idea that these coins have been quietly circulating for nearly half a century, potentially passing through thousands of transactions without anyone realizing their significance. Imagine receiving one as change at a corner shop, slipping it into your pocket without a second thought, unaware that it might carry a rare die characteristic or an unusual strike that sets it apart from millions of others. That possibility keeps collectors searching, sifting through bulk lots, revisiting old collections, and even checking the coins they receive in everyday transactions. Stories of discovery continue to surface, each adding another layer to the coin's mystique. A hobbyist in Western Australia once shared how he nearly overlooked a worn 1977 5-cent coin during a routine search, only to notice, under magnification, a distinct doubling on the Queen's portrait and lettering. That single find led him down a path of research, eventually connecting with other collectors who had found similar pieces. Together, they pieced together a clearer picture of the coin's variations, turning isolated discoveries into a recognized area of interest within Australian numismatics. The demand for these coins has grown steadily, particularly for examples that clearly exhibit the most desirable characteristics: strong strikes, visible doubling, or unique die features. Condition plays a crucial role as well. Coins that have avoided heavy circulation and retain their original luster are especially prized, as they make it easier to observe the subtle details that define these rare variants. When such a coin appears at auction, it often attracts intense interest, with collectors eager to secure a piece of this understated yet fascinating chapter in Australia's minting history. And then comes the moment where all that quiet intrigue transforms into something tangible, something measurable. When a verified example with strong, distinctive features and excellent preservation crosses the auction block, the results can be astonishing. What was once dismissed as ordinary spare change suddenly commands serious attention, with recorded sales in heritage auctions reaching from $500 to as high as $10,000, depending on the coin's condition, clarity of its unique traits, and the level of competition among bidders. And just when you think you've grasped the hidden potential of Australia's 5-cent coins, the next discovery looms even larger, even more elusive, promising a story that pushes the boundaries of rarity and value far beyond anything you've seen so far. Next up, in the world of Australian numismatics, some coins don't shout their value from the surface, they conceal it in silence, like sealed evidence waiting for the right expert to reopen the case. The 1981 Australian 5-cent coin belongs to that exact category of mystery. A coin that spent decades moving through everyday transactions with no suspicion attached to it, yet has quietly built a reputation among collectors as one of the more unpredictable pieces of modern Australian coinage. When it comes to rare era discovery and private auction demand, the year 1981 itself sits in an interesting phase of Australian minting history, where production had stabilised at the Royal Australian Mint, but subtle inconsistencies still escaped into circulation, only to be discovered years later by collectors who began treating pocket change like forensic material. When you first examine the coin, it carries the familiar weight of cupronickel, cold and steady in the hand, almost clinical in its simplicity. On the obverse sits the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the Arnold Machin design still firmly in use, presenting the Queen in a composed right-facing profile. The inscription Elizabeth II, Australia, 1981, arcs around her image with restrained elegance. But what seasoned collectors often focus on is not the obvious portrait itself, but the microscopic consistency of its strike. Because in 1981, slight variations in die pressure and hub alignment occasionally created coins where the facial contours appear either unusually softened or unexpectedly sharp, as if two different levels of production quality briefly overlapped during the same year. Flip the coin, and you're met again with Stuart Devlin's echidna, a design so deeply embedded in Australian decimal identity that it almost fades into familiarity, until you begin to inspect it properly. The spines of the echidna, which should appear evenly textured and finely structured, sometimes reveal anomalies on certain 1981 strikes. In rare instances, collectors have identified what appears to be subtle die fatigue patterns, where the spines lose definition in a directional flow, suggesting the die may have been used beyond optimal minting life before replacement. The word 5 cents above the creature, normally crisp and evenly spaced, can in select examples show slight distortion or shadowed doubling. Not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to change the coin's classification in specialist circles. What makes 1981 particularly fascinating is not a single famous mint era, but rather the scattered nature of its anomalies. Unlike earlier years where production transitions sometimes created more identifiable varieties, 1981 is a year that behaves almost like a hidden mosaic, small inconsistencies spread across large mintage volumes, waiting to be found one coin at a time. There are documented cases of off-center strikes where the design shifts just enough to create an asymmetrical rim balance, as well as broad strike examples where the collar fails to properly contain the metal, allowing the coin to expand slightly during striking. These errors are not common, and when they do appear, they often come from old bulk lots or estate collections that sat untouched for decades. One of the most compelling aspects of the 1981 5-cent coin story is how many of its most valuable examples surfaced not in formal mint documentation, but in private discoveries. A recurring theme among Australian collectors involves inherited coin tins, ordinary household containers filled over years, often without any awareness of their potential significance. In several reported cases, coins from these tins were later examined under magnification and found to exhibit unusual die characteristics, including doubled lettering and atypical strike depth. These discoveries didn't come from vaults or museums, but from kitchen drawers and garage shelves, reinforcing the idea that Australia's coin history is still actively being rediscovered in domestic spaces. The private auction world has played a crucial role in shaping the reputation of this coin. Unlike standard public sales, private transactions often involve pieces that display more complex or less immediately categorized traits. Coins that don't fit neatly into mainstream grading descriptions, but are nonetheless highly desirable to specialist collectors. In these circles, a 1981 5-cent coin with strong visual anomalies or exceptional preservation can become the subject of quiet bidding wars, where provenance, eye appeal, and rarity of specific mint characteristics matter far more than face value or circulation history. There is also an almost investigative quality to collecting this particular year. Enthusiasts often describe the process of studying 1981 coins as similar to reviewing archived evidence, where each specimen must be compared against known standards, examined under varying lighting angles, and evaluated for subtle deviations. Some collectors focus specifically on strike sharpness, while others search for die clashes, where elements of the obverse and reverse designs faintly imprint onto each other due to pressure misalignment during minting. These clashes, when present, can create ghost-like impressions that are only visible under careful inspection, adding another layer of intrigue to an already understated coin. Despite its relatively modern origin, the 1981 5-cent coin has developed a kind of underground reputation among Australian numismatists. It doesn't carry the dramatic scarcity of early pre-decimal pieces, nor the obvious fame of major commemorative issues, but instead thrives in the grey area between common circulation and rare anomaly. That ambiguity is exactly what fuels its appeal. Collectors are not simply chasing a known rarity, they are actively searching for undiscovered variation. The possibility that the next coin pulled from circulation might reveal something previously undocumented. What keeps this coin particularly alive in collector discussions is the ongoing belief that more variations remain unclassified. Because many of the known valuable examples surface through private channels rather than official mint reporting, there is a lingering sense that the full spectrum of 1981 anomalies has never been completely mapped. That uncertainty transforms every unexamined coin into a potential discovery, every old roll into a possible breakthrough, and every inherited collection into a hidden archive waiting to be decoded. And that is where the true tension builds, not in what is known about the coin, but in what might still be hidden, somewhere in circulation, or perhaps already sitting unnoticed in a forgotten container. Could be another example with the exact combination of strike quality, die anomaly, and preservation that elevates it into serious collector territory. When such coins surface in private auctions, competition can become intense, driven by both scarcity and the quiet prestige of owning a confirmed rarity from an otherwise ordinary year. In these moments, Values have been recorded reaching between $6,000 and $20,000 in private auctions, depending entirely on condition, rarity of the era, and the strength of collector demand at the time. But just when collectors think they understand the patterns of the 1980s minting era, the next coin completely disrupts that confidence, because it introduces variations so subtle, so rare, and so scattered across circulation that most people never even realize they've handled one, until it's far too late. Next up, there are coins that enter circulation quietly, coins that never announce themselves as anything special, and yet decades later they re-emerge as objects of obsession, studied under magnification like ancient artifacts pulled from the soil. The 1983 Australian 5-cent coin is one of those pieces that at first seems entirely uneventful, almost forgettable in the vast sea of Australian decimal coinage, yet among dedicated numismatists it has developed a reputation built not on fame, but on the strange unpredictability of its surviving era varieties and the scarcity of high-grade, visually dramatic specimens that escaped heavy circulation across the country during the early 1980s. It is a coin that did not begin its life as rare, but in the slow, grinding passage of time, it has become something else entirely in the eyes of collectors who understand that rarity is not always born, it is sometimes revealed. When you first look at the obverse, the design feels familiar in a way that almost lulls the mind into assuming there is nothing new to discover. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II sits with composed dignity, facing right, her features rendered in the enduring Machian effigy style that defined Australian decimal currency for decades. Around her profile, the inscription Elizabeth II Australia 1983 forms a precise circular boundary, each letter struck into cupronickel with mechanical consistency that, under normal circumstances, suggests uniformity rather than uniqueness. Yet experienced collectors often know that the truth hides in the imperfections of that very consistency. In certain 1983 strikes, the Queen's neckline and hair detail show subtle variations in relief, sometimes appearing slightly softened, as if the die had begun to lose its sharpness earlier than expected, while other examples show unusually crisp definition that suggests a freshly prepared die, struck only a limited number of planches before being retired. Turn the coin over, and the familiar Australian echidna reappears, designed by Stuart Devlin, its spiny body etched into the metal with a balance of simplicity and texture that has made it one of the most recognizable reverse designs in the nation's numismatic history. The inscription 5 cents arches above the creature, while the ground beneath it is filled with fine textural dots intended to simulate natural terrain. But in the 1983 mintage, something subtle yet significant begins to emerge when you examine enough examples side by side. Some coins display what collectors refer to as uneven die flow, where the echidna's spines seem to lean or blur slightly in one direction, suggesting the die may have experienced prolonged use without timely resurfacing or replacement. In other instances, the lettering above the design shows faint doubling or shadowing, not strong enough to be classified as dramatic hub doubling in most cases, but still noticeable enough under magnification to spark debate among specialists. The year 1983 itself sits within a period of high-volume production at the Royal Australian Mint, where efficiency and output were priorities, and millions of 5-cent coins were struck to meet everyday transactional demand across Australia. In such an environment, perfection is assumed but not guaranteed, and it is within this gap between expectation and reality that numismatic interest begins to form. Coins from this year were not intended to be rare, nor were they struck with any commemorative purpose, which makes the existence of valuable era varieties all the more intriguing. They are accidents of industrial precision, moments where machinery, pressure, timing, or die condition diverged just enough to leave behind a permanent anomaly. What makes the 1983 5-cent coin particularly compelling is the way its most desirable traits often hide in plain sight. There are known examples of off-center strikes where the design shifts slightly away from the coin's central axis, creating an uneven rim that immediately distinguishes the piece from standard production. These are not always dramatic misalignments, but even a slight deviation can transform an ordinary coin into a sought-after error. In other cases, collectors have documented strike-through errors, where foreign materials such as grease or debris temporarily interfered with the die, leaving sections of the design weak, partially missing, or unusually smooth, while surrounding areas remain sharply defined. These types of errors are especially valued because they capture a frozen moment of mechanical disruption, a literal imprint of imperfection during mass production. There are also stories that circulate within Australian collecting circles about die crack progression on certain 1983 issues. A die crack begins as a microscopic fracture in the metal die itself, but as production continues, that crack can extend and imprint itself onto every subsequent coin struck, leaving raised lines or irregular markings that evolve over time. In the case of some 1983 5-cent coins, these die cracks have been observed running through parts of the echidna design or into the surrounding field, creating a visual narrative of wear that builds with each strike. For collectors, these progressive die states are particularly fascinating because they allow multiple coins from the same die to be compared like frames in a sequence, each showing a slightly different stage of deterioration. One of the most compelling aspects of this coin story is how many of its notable discoveries have come not from official mint documentation, but from private hands, people sorting through inherited collections, bankrolls stored for decades, or forgotten jars accumulated over years of casual saving. There is a recurring pattern in these discoveries. A coin is initially dismissed as ordinary, then later revisited under better lighting or higher magnification, revealing unexpected detail that changes its classification entirely. In one widely discussed case among Australian collectors, a small group of 1983 5-cent coins sourced from a long-forgotten household collection displayed unusually strong strike characteristics with sharp echidna detail and clean, well-defined lettering that stood out dramatically against typical circulation examples. This contrast between the ordinary and the exceptional is what gives the 1983 5-cent coin its enduring appeal. It does not rely on low mintage figures or commemorative status. Instead, its value is built on the tension between mass production and isolated imperfection. Every coin from this year carries the same basic design, yet a tiny fraction carries something more. A deviation, a flaw, a variation that transforms them into objects of intense collector interest. That uncertainty is what drives people to continue searching, examining bulk lots, and revisiting old accumulations with renewed attention, hoping to uncover a specimen that breaks from the expected pattern. Even in today's market, these coins appear sporadically in auctions, often emerging from private consignments where their significance was only realized after careful examination. When a verified error or exceptionally high-grade example appears, competition can become intense, particularly among collectors who specialize in modern Australian decimal varieties. The appeal lies not only in rarity, but in the story embedded within the coin itself, a story of industrial precision interrupted, of unnoticed variation preserved for decades, waiting for recognition. And so the 1983 Australian 5-cent coin continues its quiet existence across the country, still capable of being found in circulation, still capable of being overlooked, and still capable of surprising even experienced collectors who thought they had seen every variation the series could offer. Yet when the right specimen surfaces, one with clear, verifiable error traits or exceptional preservation, it can command serious attention in private and public markets alike, with documented auction results reaching from $5,500 to $15,000 depending on condition, rarity of the error, and collector demand at the time. And that's exactly where things shift again, because the next coin doesn't just rely on rarity or error, it carries an entirely different kind of intrigue. the kind that turns everyday change into a long-term treasure hunt across Australia, and once you see it, you'll never look at your 5-cent coins the same way again. Next up, there are certain coins that don't announce themselves with fame or mythology. They enter the world as routine production, pass through ordinary hands, and then quietly disappear into the background noise of circulation. The 1984 Australian 5-cent coin is one of those pieces, a coin that most Australians would have handled without a second thought, yet decades later, it has become a subject of careful scrutiny among numismatists who treat it less like currency and more like a surviving fragment of industrial history. To understand why this particular coin now appears in heritage auctions with surprising regularity, you have to step into the atmosphere of the mid-1980s at the Royal Australian Mint, where production was efficient, mechanical, and designed for volume, but never entirely free from imperfection. When you first encounter the 1984 5-cent piece, it presents itself with a kind of quiet familiarity that almost discourages closer inspection. The obverse carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, still in the refined matching design. Her profile facing right with calm authority. The inscription Elizabeth II, Australia 1984, wraps around her image in precise lettering, the kind of consistency that suggests absolute control at a glance. But experienced collectors know that 1984 sits in a fascinating period where die preparation and striking pressure occasionally produced subtle irregularities that only reveal themselves under magnification. In some specimens, the Queen's hair detail appears slightly flattened, as though the die had been used beyond its optimal sharpness, while in others the facial contours appear unusually crisp, hinting at early-state strikes pulled from fresh dies before wear began to set in. Turn the coin, and the reverse reveals Stuart Devlin's echidna, a design so deeply embedded in Australian decimal identity that it often hides its complexity behind familiarity. The creature is centered above the denomination 5 cents. Its spines carefully etched into cupra nickel, surrounded by a textured field meant to evoke natural ground. At first glance, the design appears uniform across millions of coins, but 1984 examples tell a more complicated story when examined closely. Some coins show what collectors describe as uneven die flow, where the spines of the echidna appear slightly softened or stretched in a single direction, suggesting prolonged die usage under high production pressure. Others reveal faint traces of die fatigue in the surrounding field, where texture begins to blur in a way that should not occur in early-state production, hinting that certain dies may have been pushed beyond expected service intervals. The mid-1980s were a period of heavy output at the Mint, as Australia's currency system had fully matured and demand for circulating coinage remained consistently high. Within that environment, the focus was efficiency, and while quality control remained strict, the reality of industrial-scale minting is that small deviations inevitably occur. A die can only maintain perfect sharpness for so long, a press can only maintain perfect alignment until minor shifts accumulate. These tiny mechanical truths are what give the 1984 5-cent coin its hidden depth. What appears identical on the surface is, in reality, a vast field of microscopic variation waiting to be discovered by those willing to look closely enough. Collectors who specialize in this year often describe the experience of studying it as similar to examining a set of fingerprints. No two coins are truly identical when viewed under sufficient magnification and proper lighting. Some exhibit light die clashes, where faint traces of the echidna or lettering appear subtly mirrored into the opposing side of the coin due to momentary misalignment during striking. These clashes are not immediately obvious in circulation-worn pieces, but in better-preserved examples, they can create ghost-like impressions that intrigue specialists and spark debate over classification. There are also instances of strike-through errors documented among 1984 specimens, where foreign materials such as grease or microscopic debris interfered with the striking process. In these cases, portions of the design may appear weak, partially missing, or unusually smooth, while surrounding areas remain sharply defined. These errors are particularly valued because they capture a specific moment of disruption within an otherwise controlled industrial process, effectively freezing a mechanical anomaly into permanent form. For collectors, it is not just the appearance of the error that matters, but the story it implies about what was happening inside the mint at that exact moment. One of the more intriguing aspects of the 1984 5-cent coin is how frequently significant discoveries have emerged from private collections rather than formal institutional records. Across Australia, stories persist of old coin accumulations, tins, jars and bank-wrapped rolls stored away for decades, later yielding unexpected finds when revisited by collectors or family members. In several documented cases, 1984 coins pulled from these forgotten collections displayed unusually strong strikes with crisp echidna detail and sharply defined lettering, suggesting early die-state production that was not widely recognized at the time of circulation. There is a particular kind of tension that surrounds this coin in collector circles. Because it sits in a transitional psychological space, it is modern enough to still be found in large numbers, yet old enough that its subtle variations have had decades to emerge and be studied. That combination creates an ongoing sense of possibility. Every handful of coins from the 1980s still carries the potential to reveal something previously unnoticed, and the 1984 5-cent piece remains one of the years where that possibility feels especially alive. In auction settings, the coin takes on an entirely different identity. What was once dismissed as pocket change becomes a carefully evaluated specimen, where strike quality, surface preservation, and the presence of identifiable mint characteristics determine its desirability. Coins that display strong visual anomalies or exceptional condition often attract focused attention from specialist collectors who understand that rarity in modern coinage is rarely about mintage numbers alone, it is about survivability of distinctive traits. As a result, competition can intensify quickly when a high-quality or clearly anomalous 1984 example appears in a heritage auction environment, especially when provenance suggests long-term preservation outside general circulation. Perhaps the most compelling part of the 1984 5-cent story is that it refuses to settle into certainty. Unlike ancient coins with well-documented rarity or commemorative issues with fixed narratives, this coin exists in a fluid space where new discoveries can still reshape understanding. Each examined specimen adds a small piece to an evolving picture of how it was produced, how dyes behaved under pressure, and how minor variations escaped into the public domain unnoticed. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps collectors returning to it, coin after coin, year after year, examining edges, surfaces, and microscopic details with the hope of finding something that breaks the pattern. Because in the world of Australian numismatics, it is often the most ordinary-looking coins that carry the most unexpected stories, waiting silently until the right eyes finally notice them. In heritage auction records, exceptional examples of this coin have achieved results ranging between $5,700 and $12,000. Australia's hidden 5-cent treasures, coins that most people have held without a second thought, yet quietly carry stories, errors, and rare variations that continue to surprise collectors across the country. From everyday circulation pieces to unexpected auction discoveries, each of these coins proves one powerful truth. Sometimes the smallest coins in your pocket can hold the biggest secrets in Australian numismatic history. So next time you receive change, take that extra second, slow down, and really look at what you're holding. Because somewhere in those ordinary 5-cent pieces, there could still be a rare strike, an unseen error, or a forgotten variation waiting to be rediscovered. If you enjoyed this journey into Australia's coin history, Make sure you stay connected with the Coin Studio for more deep dives into hidden rarities, valuable discoveries, and the untold stories behind Australian currency. Subscribe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next reveal, because the next coin we uncover might just change everything you think you know about pocket change.